right, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to open up tonight with this quote from Nathaniel Thomas Wright, who we affectionately call N.T. Wright. He wrote this: "The trial before Pilate is central to understanding what happens when the kingdom of God faces up against the kingdom of Caesar." So that's just a one sentence out of a book that he wrote, and the point there being there are two kingdoms that are colliding here, that are going head to head. And in this trial scene that we're about to dive into for the next hour or so is definitely a spiritual, supernatural event of a non-worldly kingdom going to war against an earthly kingdom. And we shall see who comes out the victor.
Well, don't we kind of already know?
Shh!
Oh.
Don't ruin it! Don't ruin
first
it!
You got to tell me what your shirt says, because I'm going to sit here all night and stare at it, trying to figure it out.
It's an excellent question. So glad you asked.
Well, it's bugging me.
Specifically for tonight.
I was like,
I did wear this specifically for this evening.
Theta, but that's all I know.
Yeah. All right. So this is a Greek word which is missing some punctuation. So, but it's pronounced eletheirumai. Eletheirumai. And eletheirumai comes from, I don't remember the numbers, but what are the numbers? 8, 2 something. 832. Okay. So in John chapter 8, verse 32, Jesus says something to the effect of, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Right? So the word eletheirumai is the word for freedom. It means I am continuously being set free. So tonight we are talking about, well, one of the things we'll be talking about is truth. And so this kind of reminded me of that whole thing, and I thought I'd wear it tonight. So thank you for asking that question.
Welcome.
You played right into my...
I tried.
Was it created to be like a soccer shirt or?
Yeah, this was a mission trip shirt from my senior year in high school.
Okay.
So we all wore them. Postmark, that's down here on my bum.
Well, you know what? Kudos for still being able to wear a
Yes.
high school shirt, because
Yeah.
I don't think I
could get one leg. I don't think I've got anything left.
I couldn't for a long while, so but I can again. So yeah, this was a mission trip shirt to the Brooklyn, New York. There was a coffee shop there that my former youth minister started and to be a specific ministry to the community, and he also started a church, and the church was called Postmark. So we went there to be in service to him. Now tonight, as far as what we're doing, is we're basically just covering the material on Pilate, and I don't think we'll have any trouble getting to the end of our particular series lesson that we started last week. So I hope you all brought your papers back, because if you don't, well, that's just very unfortunate for you. All right, so
we're doing last week's papers.
Yeah, we're finishing last week's lesson, and we're doing the trial scene with Pontius Pilate. So some things that you ought to know about this man before we dive into the text. We read the story last week. We kind of ended with me presenting the chiastic structure of this trial scene, meaning it works into a point and then it comes back out, mirroring the episodes that happened before it.
I'm totally losing it.
And so just some information that we might want to set in the back of our minds, which would have been ready for the first audience, and certainly the people who lived through this. So Pilate had only really been in office in Caesarea for since about AD 26. Now, I believe that Jesus died in AD 30, 31-ish. So he's only been in office for about 4 to 5 years. Okay, and so the person that put him there was a very strong anti-Semitic. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. You might be able to Google it if you truly cared. But the guy that put him there was a pretty high up in the Roman world. Okay, he was pretty close to the Caesar, and in fact tried to lead a coup against Caesar. Okay.
Now I gotta look it up because I know who you're talking about now.
Okay, so he led a coup against Caesar. Now, anyone who is going to be a disciple of this person who led the coup against Caesar is going to be walking on some pretty thin ice, right? Some pretty shaky ground. And so Pilate now finds himself in this very difficult political situation, because the person who helped put him in his position of power has now been killed for being a rebel against the empire, and so he has to somehow prove that he is a worthy person to be there. So when he's first put in office, he decides that he wants to give a huge sign of honor to Caesar. And the way that he does that is that he has all these shields with Tiberius's face imprinted on it, like stamped into it, put up around the temple. Okay, so Pilate orders for all these shields to be put up in the temple, and of course, I mean, how do you think the Jews did with all that?
They were very unhappy.
Very, very unhappy for sure. Let's not forget, I mentioned the golden eagle incident when they tried to put the golden eagle up above the entrance to the temple, and how that caused like a riot, right? And then several people died because of that. Well, there's as the story goes, about 500 Jews are angry at Pilate because of this, and so they go to the temple to take these shields down, and Pilate knows that this is happening, so he takes his guards and he hides them kind of in the temple complex. And as these 500 Jews come into the complex to take the shields down, he stops and says, what are you doing? And they're like, well, we will not allow for these shields to be up in our temple to Yahweh. And so he then calls out all of his guards, and so it's more like it's an ambush, it's a trap at this point. And he says, are you willing to die for this? Are you willing to put your life on the line just to have these shields removed? And they sat down, they kneeled down and they exposed their necks and said, go ahead and kill us, because we'd rather die than see our temple defiled by the image of Caesar in our temple. And so, what do you think Pilate did?
He probably did it to prove his
beheaded him.
authority and show forth.
I say no.
Make them an example.
Yeah, that's what I think he did.
Why no?
Because of the problem it would cause in Rome.
He in fact withheld deadly force, and he allowed them to live, and the shields came down.
Wow.
Well, he was in trouble with Rome anyway.
Well,
here it is. Here's the guy's name, Valerius Gratus, right?
yeah.
Valerius
Yeah.
Gratus, Gratus. And he went through three high priests before he found one to his liking and conscience overtook one.
So he lost that political maneuver, all right, and it was all in attempts to try and smooth things over in Rome with Tiberius, because his predecessor, person tried to dethrone Tiberius, which didn't work, right? So that was one instance. And the next is another instance that happens prior to this event with Jesus is Pilate wants to kind of help further the production of the city, right? And so he orders the building of an aqueduct. Now, we all know what aqueducts are, right? So they carry water from long distances, and they have these archways, right? And they're actually a marvel of engineering, right? So like every half mile or so, it would slope down 18 inches. If it was to slope down more than that, so like over a half mile, the grade is 18 inches or so. If it was more than that, then the water pressure would be too great for their pipes. If it was too less than that, then the water would not flow.
Isn't that amazing?
So they had just figured it out perfectly to work, and he already had aqueducts in Caesarea, which was a marvel of a city, carrying, by the way, hot water to the people.
Wow.
So they had hot water in their homes. And so anyways, he wanted to bring this to Jerusalem, which had a serious water problem, especially during the festival seasons when the population would go up by about 1 million people, right? So he wants to build this aqueduct, but guess how he wants to pay for it?
Taxing the people, I'm assuming, or the temple tax.
Yes, he wants to take the temple tax. Okay, so the temple tax, the money that's specifically to go to preserve the temple, all right? He wants to dip into that money and take it and pay for his aqueduct. He wins. They cause an uproar. You're stealing from God to pay for this aqueduct or whatever, and he ends up winning actually that particular maneuver. So we've got one check in the Jews' box, and we've got one check in Pilate's box. So tonight we're going to be talking about a third meeting between the two groups of people, and let's see perhaps who wins between the two of them. Okay, so lots of things to consider tonight, and we definitely want to remember those stories because tonight is all about the political prowess of Pilate versus the Jews. All right, who's going to be the victor? And so we'll start again and read the text. I don't need this page. Yeah, I know. I threw it on the ground. Okay, so let's do what we did last week. Let's just start over here, and we'll just read through chapter 18:28 through verse 16 of chapter 19, which is just the scene of the trial.
You want it out. Okay.
John beginning at what verse?
28. 18:28.
18:28.
Yeah.
Chapter 18.
Okay. Do we just read 18 through 32 like you have it broken down here? Or?
We're on page 60.
Oh, you backed up.
Oh, you got that?
I mean, that's just where the text
It's just
was.
Yeah, we've got it
So-
already
Oh,
out.
yeah, written.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. 18:28. Then they led Jesus
It was
from
last week.
Caiaphus into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die."
Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this is on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Pilate answered, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth?
When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews? So they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him, and they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him slaps in the face. You want me to go on, or what?
Pass it on.
Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid.
And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it has been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin.
As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was a day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king. So they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he then handed him over to them to be crucified.
Okay, so here's what we got going on here. We've got a two maneuverings happening, all right, and we've got Jesus over here, and you can always tell which one's Jesus because he's always wearing a Michigan hat, okay? Because Jesus is a Michigan fan.
Blasphemy.
All right. We've got Pilate over here.
Jesus has a sense of humor. He'd have to.
We've got Pilate over here, and we know it's Pilate because he's wearing an Ohio State hat. Okay, and then we've got the Jews over here, and we know it's the Jews because that's a really bad drawing of like a bishop hat, like the high priest, would wear. So, anyways, oh yeah, beards, that'd be good.
And
Little curly things along the
or
side.
whatever those little things are down the side.
The Jewish.
Those little curly views.
There you go, yeah.
Which,
They didn't have back then, but
yeah. But anyway, Jesus had a beard too, right? Because all men have beards. So real men have beards. So
That's what Phil, what's his name, says, the duck guy.
oh yeah. All right, so we've got some maneuvering going on, right? So Pilate's kind of in the middle. He has to go out to these guys, and he has to go in to this guy, right? And so he's going back and forth inside the Praetorium, outside of it, to appease this mob mentality. And so there's really two different, for just a lack of a better term, like battles happening here. Okay, so there's one between these two, and so there's one between these two, and then him and these two, and we get to see how Pilate tries to maneuver both of them, kind of being stuck between Jesus and the Jews. And so it's really fascinating to watch how this all kind of plays out, and we're just kind of going to go through this just one thing at a time. And if you all have any particular questions that you want to ask or statements or whatever, go ahead, because I just got information basically to share with a few discussion questions at the end. So I'll probably insert some extra questions here and there as we go through the material to kind of fill out our time. So on page 62 there, after the diagrammed outline that we have, we've got the breakdown of the encounter with Pilate and chief priests. So in the first bracket, A, right, so he's outside, the Jews are demanding Jesus' death. All right. We find that that the insights inserted into the story reveal that the entire trial that occurs is entirely out of their control. Right. So John kind of tells us from the outset that what's about to follow really has already kind of been put in place. Like all the sides involved really have no real. They aren't capable of really acting outside of what God has designed for them to do, right? So they've been set aside for a purpose to take Jesus to the cross. And he says this, to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. So the whole very fact that the Jews are taking Jesus to Pilate is all because of the fact that he has to die by crucifixion. Right, because the prophecy was that he would be lifted up, raised and lifted up, and Jews, the way that they killed people was by stoning them, right, which is not being raised or lifted up. So, in order to fulfill that particular prophecy, what has to happen is that Jesus has to be crucified, raised up onto the cross. So everything that's about to happen in this trial is to make it so that Pilate has to crucify Jesus, because otherwise the whole thing kind of collapses on itself, and Jesus is not the Messiah.
Well, Pilate even says, take him yourself and kill him.
Yeah, take him.
They bring him back to him.
Yeah, so.
He was God. Whose law was he breaking? The Jewish law or the government's law? Because
Jews.
so he was breaking their law, and then they say we're not permitted to put anyone to death. Are they saying they can't put anyone to death by crucifixion?
The Romans wouldn't let him put anybody to death. They couldn't pass that sentence.
Well,
he broke Jewish law, but they want the government to kill him.
Well, okay, so first of all, it was wrong for any person to claim deity even inside the empire, because that was only of Caesar, or somebody who Caesar would deify, so the Caesar that followed you could deify you, kind of like the pharaohs did, right? So that was kind of an honor only given to the uppity up. So he really was kind of breaking both societies' laws. Even though, he really was God, so he was right.
But when you read, if you pay attention in verse 15, it just shows how badly they want him killed, because instead of saying God is our king, he's the one that we acknowledge as such. They plainly state, we have no king. We have no king but Caesar. Mm-hmm. They've done away with They don't care. They hate him so much, and they want him dead so bad, that now they're throwing their lot in with
Could they have been
Caesar.
some of the same people though that just right before that had gone and listened to him speak and seen some of the miracles that he'd done? And,
Well, I think
I mean, or do we have two separate crowds here? We have the ones that were following him and
Yeah.
then the ones that are
Yeah,
just-
well, I mean, we have to remember it was only back in chapter 12 when, or 11, sorry, at the end of chapter 11 when they had the secret council and they were afraid that the public was all going to go and be with Jesus because of all the great signs that he was performing. And so it was the Jewish leaders who were trying to get Jesus killed. And so for those reasons, and there's also other instances in the gospel where it says that he was gaining sort of the favor, right? People were starting to follow him and believe in him. I think in the setting that we have here, the people who are trying to kill him are the quote unquote Jews, right, that we've talked about,
Yeah.
right? So it's not necessarily Joe Schmo who lives down the street in Jerusalem, right? It's this particular class of people who, for them, it would be advantageous for Jesus to be out of the picture. I really don't think it's classically we've been taught they praise Hosanna on Sunday and they shout crucify on Friday, right? I don't think it's that.
The same group.
No, I don't think it's that. I think this is a smaller group that has a lot more political influence than the average guy in the street of Jerusalem.
The Sanhedrin, and not even all of them.
Yeah, we don't.
Nicodemus and
We don't really know. We don't know if it was the whole Sanhedrin or not. It very well could have been, because they all would have been there for the festival, right? So they all would have been present in Jerusalem, and we do know that there are a couple voices of reason in that in the Jewish trial. And we know Nicodemus spoke up amongst them in the secret council that happened back in chapter 11. So it could have been the whole Sanhedrin. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and John clearly doesn't want to tell us. He just says it was a council of the
Yeah,
Jews.
It doesn't matter.
How much interaction did Pilate have with Jesus prior to the trial? I mean, you mentioned that, the whole aqueduct thing and the shield thing, that had to do with their God, and they didn't consider Jesus their God. But
Right.
how much interaction did he have with Jesus that made him so conflicted between going back and forth? Because it would seem to me like if he really
Mm-hmm.
didn't care, it would be as simple, okay, you want him dead, we'll kill him, fine, and be done with it.
Okay.
It seems to me like
Yeah.
he may have had some curiosity about Jesus.
Yeah, I think you're raising an excellent point. All right. Why does Pilate care at all?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, why?
Okay. Now, remember the rules of this class.
but
Unless I bring up another gospel,
it's not allowed.
it's not allowed. All right. So we're staying in the confines of the Gospel of John. All right. So yes, but in another gospel, his wife has a dream, right, and warns Pilate, there's going to be this man, let him go, right. So, anyways,
Really trying to, wasn't he? I mean, he tried.
Well, he just sounds like, to me,
It's
Pilate.
wishy-washy.
Well, he
Yeah.
sounds to me like every Christian on this planet.
Yeah.
Before you're converted, you have this issue in your head of, do I believe in Jesus and who he says he is, or do I go with the world and who they say he is? I mean, we all have been there, like Pilate was. We've all been in that place of, do I accept or don't I accept? I mean,
I don't think Pilate is ever on the verge of accepting Jesus.
I think
Okay.
it's all a political move.
Yes, I think for him, he's trying to gain the political upper hand. Remember, this is the man who lost to the Jews by having to take the sign, the shields down, right? He won against the Jews by building his aqueduct, and he is particularly known as a violent man. He will be deposed for being too violent. And so for him to kill another Jew is not a big deal, right? So what the question that I see you raising here is what does Pilate have to gain from this interaction, right? And so the whole reason why I think he tries to be on Jesus' side is for political reasons. He wants the Jews to submit to him. And so it's going to unfold that way. All right? So let's go on to the next section. Oh, and we talked about this last week, but before we go on, how about the fact that they have like nothing to bring about this man? What accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." Which is essentially the fact of
What did you do? What was it?
Yeah.
what was the evil that he did?
Yeah.
Well, we brought him to you, therefore he must have done. So it's like they had nothing. All right, and so he calls them out on having nothing. Now in the next section, which is 33 verses 33 through 38a, there are three important facts to point out. The fact that when he enters in and he questions Jesus, he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Okay, so this should shock us for a couple reasons. One, the first thing is that Jesus responds. All right, this is the only time of the four Gospels where Jesus says anything more than "It is as you say." Right, when he asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So this is not the silent, be still kind of Jesus. He's going to engage Pilate in conversation. And so right now the readers who may have also read Matthew, Mark, or Luke up to this point would read this and think, "Hey, that's different." So this is Jesus did more than just stand there and take it. He did engage Pilate, but there's also a progression in the way he responds, right? So he simply answers his question with another question, right? Classical Jesus, right? So Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Right? So in Pilate's question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Where did Pilate get this idea that the charge they're bringing against him is that he's claiming to be the king of the Jews? Because remember, in one stanza earlier, there's no charge that they have to bring against him. So where is Pilate getting this idea that he is claiming to be the king of the Jews?
Good question, Jonathan.
Thank you. Well, what do you all think?
Would you say the question again, please?
All right, so where does Pilate get the idea that Jesus is claiming to be the king of the Jews? Because up to this point in the gospel, in this scene here, they have not brought that charge against him. They said, "He's just an evildoer. You put him to death." Mm-hmm. So where does he get this king of the Jews thing from?
Yeah, where did it come from?
Things that make you go, "Huh."
Yeah.
Right?
But we can't use any other Gospels?
Nope.
I don't know. I think if I was Pilate, I would be incredibly confused and frustrated with this Jewish community because they're so devoted to their God and their laws and their temple, but they're so hateful for this one single man. It just would seem like, what kind of group are you?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're so devoted to a God you say is holy and loving, and yet you're so hateful. You want to murder someone for no reason.
Yeah.
What's wrong with you people?
But whenever they brought him in on the donkey, they were putting the coats down and the palm branches down. They were hailing him as the king, and I would assume that Pilate had heard of this. I mean, we can't assume that, he just doesn't know everything that's going on. I mean, he knows what's going on in where he has jurisdiction. He knows what's going on. It's reported to him. He had surely heard about what happened. I mean, maybe it's not specifically
I agree with Bob,
point-
that's the only
pointed
thing I can
out.
think of too.
But he knows. And there's a reason, the one thing it's always, I think, when it says in verse 8, whenever, as things unfold in Pilate's afraid. Because it says in verse 8, therefore when Pilate heard this statement, whenever they were talking about they want him crucified, and he brings him out to him with the crown of thorns on everything, and he says, behold the man. The chief priests and the officers saw him, and they started saying, crucify him. But they said that he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He was already afraid.
I think he was afraid of what was going to happen to politically because of the unrest.
Well, we're not there yet, so let's hold off on that, and we'll get there. All right?
Well, I think there's more going on than what Pilate can put it all together, but it's not just.
He'd never heard about this.
It's not just mundane, regular stuff that's going on, but he's afraid.
Well, I think that your assessment that he has maybe learned of this from the triumphal entry scene about this guy whose people are shouting as king is probably a good bet, right? That's probably where he would, because Pilate would have entered the same way into the city, right? They would have shouted his name, Pilate, Pilate, right? And then all the people would have honored him in some way, not necessarily with the lowering of branches, but so that's just how any royal official entered into the city, right? So Jesus was not the only person marching into shouts of praise into the city. So let's move on, because you guys keep jumping to the end of the scene here, and you're once again, I'm shocked, right? Breaking the rules, all right? So Jesus responds as an equal, all right? So not only does he respond, but he responds as an equal, okay? So it's not like, he's timid about speaking to Pilate. Rather, he speaks with a certain level of authority, the same sort of authority that Pilate would seem to have. And we know that Pilate takes his response in a rather negative way, because he says to in his response, he says to him, I am not a Jew, am I? Like, you can hear almost in it the level of condescension and disgust, right? It's like, how dare you speak to me? I am not a Jew. How dare you speak to me in that way? And so, is it not your own chief priest who delivered you over to me? What have you done, right? So he's demanding an answer from this prisoner, and Jesus is not giving him an answer. He's responding to Pilate, but he's, at classical Jesus, responding with a question. All right, so which is just a great way of just stirring the pot, right, and getting people on edge. So whenever you ask me questions, I like to respond in questions too. What do you all think, right? That's how I roll. And then finally, Jesus responds as a superior to Pilate. Jesus answered in verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, so I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? Okay, couple takeaways from this before we move on to the next section. One, Jesus owns up to being a king. Okay, clearly the man is a king, right? And he makes this statement, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, typically when we hear that statement, we think, oh, it's a spiritual kingdom. Like, it's a kingdom of heaven, right? It's up there. No, that's not what that means. Okay, so when Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world or from this world, depending on the translation that you want to use there, it's the origin, right, or the kind of kingdom that it is. But Jesus' kingdom is very much on this earth. Okay, so do we see the distinction? All right, and
Not yet. It's working around in there.
okay,
Keep
so
going.
you've got Jesus standing across from Pilate. All right, Pilate, the representative of Caesar, of the earthly kingdom of the world at this point. Right, there is nobody greater than Rome, and so you've got Jesus claiming a level of superiority because he's saying that his kingdom is from on high, which means like of the gods, right? If a Roman was hearing that, that's kind of what they would think. And so it's a superior kingdom to what his is, and that its origins are not of the earth. Like, so Rome was built on war, manipulation, violence, political prowess, right? All these things that people like to claim as a badge of honor, but instead in Jesus' kingdom and his is a bad thing, and certainly as Christians we see it as a bad thing. So Jesus' kingdom is built on the righteousness of God, his faithfulness. All of our Romans people's ears should be dancing, right? So anyways, in that it is built on peace, right? It is built on something not violent, and that its authority is something that is greater than Caesar. It is of God. So the fact that it's a very powerful statement that Jesus makes here, because with it he usurps Pilate's authority by saying he comes from something that's greater than anything on this earth, but also in that it's a different kind of kingdom. It's one of peace rather than of violence, which Rome is very violent. So we should not think, though, that the statement, my kingdom is not of this world, means that it's just a spiritual kingdom. Meaning, in the spiritual realm, it's not a physical, doesn't have physical manifestations, right? Because the kingdom of God, anybody who's done a study on kingdom of God knows that it very much is influential in our world, very much influential in our world politics, and also in social justice and all sorts of things like that. So the kingdom of God very much is on this earth and present in this earth in us today, and it has very real manifestations.
So it's kind of like in the world but not of the world.
Yes.
That's real good. Which is how we're supposed to live anyway. Right?
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure I got that clear.
You got it clear.
Some person or some group of people made a lot of money over the NOW. You can buy shirts, you can buy license plates, you can buy not of this world.
Oh.
NOW,
Yeah.
you can. Somebody has made a lot of money off of the not of
Wouldn't
this
it be
world.
NOTW?
No, it's just this NOW is what they have on their.
That's Newcastle on Wheels. I'm
No.
sorry.
That would be NCOW.
It would be the space crazos that they're going back, not of this world. We're going back to.
So, Jesus, the takeaway is that Jesus responds, because in all the other Gospels he's quiet, and that he responds as an equal by answering the question with a question, and then he responds as superior by saying, well, I am a king, and it's not of this world, it's something greater. My source of authority is from up above. And so this, then he ends with going back to the whole idea of truth, right? From my shirt. You say correctly that I am king, for this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate says to him, what is truth? Okay. Now, preachers are classically known for taking these little nuggets and just blowing them way out of proportion, or what we like to call creative licensing of the text, right? And some may have made Pilate out to be some philosopher by trying to answer with this philosophical question, well, what is truth? And I don't think that's necessarily what John is trying to get across here, that Pilate is responding in a philosophical way. Rather, it's an identifier, right? Pilate is somebody who doesn't know truth. Jesus is saying, I am speaking the truth. I am truth. And with Pilate's answer, he's identifying himself as opposed to the kingdom that Jesus just announced to him. Right? So it's John's way of saying in this conversation, as the author, and drawing through this conversation, that Pilate is somebody who does not understand the truth that Jesus is expounding to him right in front of him. What is truth? Because he does not know the truth when it's plainly put in front of him.
It's like not seeing the forest with trees. Okay.
You have all these wonderful,
She does. They're right. That's good.
Because I'm so old, I've heard it all.
You were right though, it's NOTW instead of NW.
Okay.
The people that are making money.
Nobody ever tells me I'm right very often.
But what, I mean,
You were.
he comes face to face with Jesus himself. He agrees to put him to death. So Jesus dies, the curtain's torn, the earthquake happens. Does Pilate, is there any indication in Scripture that Pilate just realized what he did?
No.
He has.
No, it was the centurion, wasn't it? He truly was.
Yeah.
He's the centurion at the cross.
And his wife didn't see, I told you. I mean, there was no.
We don't know.
No.
I mean, there was no
And
revelation.
We'll have to find those
No.
out many years from now.
No. Well, I mean, just by the very fact that Pilate still remained violent and was taken into exile because of it, and he was actually later executed by Caesar. Tells us that no, he never got it.
He didn't become a believer. Let's put it
He
that
never
way.
knew the truth
That is unbelievable.
when it was
Right in his face.
talking to him.
I know.
And I really don't think we should consider his wife a believer either.
Oh, no.
I think in that omen, if you've seen the Passion of the Christ, right? She begs him to let him go, and kind of comes to him several times, and there's this real fear in her about who this man is. But I seriously, I don't think we should consider her a believer either. But I also don't think Nicodemus ever became a true disciple of Jesus. But that's another discussion for another time.
And I don't know how you prove that one.
Oh, it's easy.
Oh.
All right.
For another time.
That's for another study, another time.
Okay, so
He's full of them.
let's. I got to keep you coming back for wanting more.
Jonathan. Yeah. No flies landed on him, as my mother used to say.
There's another one. All right. Then in the next bracket, then Pilate. So he had this little spout with Jesus, right? And now he has to go back out, and he has this spout with the Jews, right? So Pilate begins an attempt to take political advantage of this Jew-Jesus situation by leveraging a man against them as their king, who he knows they hate, right? But why would he do this? So why do you think Pilate, who has just declared Jesus innocent of anything, would then, 1, relate to Jesus as their king, and 2, offer Barabbas in a trade?
He's just stirring them up.
Yeah. He's just, because he can.
Well, he's done this before with the whole shield thing. He's tested them before, and would you die for this? So I think he's testing them again.
I think you're right.
To see if they really truly want to do this, or if they're just emotional at the moment.
I mean, the very
Crowd
fact that...
mentality.
All right, so when Pilate says, well, what is truth, right? It's almost like he's saying, well, what is truth? And then he walks out and goes to the Jews, right? Mm-hmm. So he has no regard for Jesus, all right? Cares less about this man. Walks out into the crowd of the mob, right, and says, the King of the Jews, right? So it's almost like he's mocking them with
like
Jesus.
A placard, too, putting it and then saying.
Yeah, and they even go and ask.
He's king of the Jews.
Right.
So.
Well, he says, I have written what I've written, or something like that. So let it be written, so let it be done.
So noted.
Wrong movie, but go on.
Well, it was a king of some Eastern.
So noted.
All right. I thought it was a wonderful reference.
I thought it was great too.
Okay, so.
I couldn't stand any more of your cuteness.
I'm telling Erica you said that. All right, so Pilate wants to mock them by getting them to admit something. So I think that Pilate is trying to steer the Jews to get them to admit that they need Pilate to do their dirty work. And he's not going to give in until they submit, which they will. All right. So next section, D, and so this is 19:1 through 3. All right, and this is the center point, the scourging or the flogging. However you want to take that. So Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him, and they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps in the face. So Pilate has Jesus tortured for possibly a couple reasons. These reasons seem to differ from that of the synoptics. This is the turning point of the story. So one option is that Pilate wants to show power over the Jews by torturing a man for no apparent reason to them. He has already declared Jesus innocent. Or the second reason is, or could also be in addition to, Pilate wants to torture Jesus to break him into submission, get a confession that he is lying about being a king, not from this world. And the way that this is different, right? So in the structure of this particular story, the flogging is in the middle, and there's still 3 more engagements after this. When you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the flogging is more of like an appetizer before the crucifixion, right? So they take him away to be flogged, and then he's to be crucified. And so John is filling in more detail. Maybe he took some creative licensing on the story. I don't know. The point is that he's made this the centerpiece of the whole story, I think, for a reason. And that particular reason, I can't be necessarily sure. I don't know that anybody can. A couple of the commentators think that perhaps this was to bring a amount of reverence to what is happening here with Jesus. Whenever I read the flogging or scourging now, flashes of the Passion of the Christ just come to my mind.
There were times I just couldn't watch it.
And you think like it was such a somber moment, right? And they just continued to beat him, and very violent. And they used the cat of 9 tails, which was a colloquial term for it, right? And it was just basically a leather rod or staff or something with some whip-like fingers coming off that had stuff kind of woven into it, like sheep bone would be one, or glass, broken bits of glass, or even like stone, lead, like some sort of metal kind of woven into it. And so I actually know somebody who made one, and they tried to get 9, and it was too much. It was worthless at that point. So either he made it wrong, or maybe they didn't actually have 9. It was just a name, for it. But it had several sort of phalangia, whatever, and so
strips of leather.
All right. And
comes to the rescue.
and so it was then used to, basically pummel these people
To the point of death.
and bring them to the brink of death. And then the very fact that he is on the cross for as many hours as he was after enduring such a punishment is, I think, truly remarkable. Now, I mean, people would be on crosses for days at a time, typically, but he also, because he got beaten, his strength was gone. So yeah, and it would not just like cut into the skin, but it would latch on and like scrape across. It would just rip it.
Removes muscle tissue down to
Yeah.
the bone.
I was in one of the classrooms last year, and I don't know where anybody found it, but it was a branch of a thorn tree of some sort. And it was about this long, but those things were ginormous and so sharp. And I thought, however they bent that into a crown shape was just beyond me.
It hurts.
And then crammed it on his head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly a moment, because Jesus is crowned in this event, and he is robed with the purple cloak, and which are images of, obviously, of that being of a king.
This is just a thorn tree that we have.
Yeah.
And you think about
And they were bigger than that.
Yeah, they've all fallen around.
Yeah.
But to weave that into any kind of, it's been done a long time, would have ripped their hands up too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it would have just, think about, I mean, those things, they're evil looking.
I don't think we really understand.
Well, Pilate
I mean,
had to
we talk about the sacrifice, but we don't really know the agony and just.
No.
It's undescribable.
Well,
That I
when
can't
I
even-
think of like the crap that kids today watch on some of these video games and movies, and how traumatic that has got to be to their little minds, I don't even think that is as traumatic as people watching him getting whipped. And for someone like Pilate or worse to initiate it and cheer it on just shows the evil that they have in them. I mean, it's not just that he was blind to who Jesus was, but he truly
They didn't
evil.
life.
I mean, evil. Like when I think of, when they talk about the stories about evil spirits coming out of people, I think Pilate had to have that in him, to be so blinded, to cheer on something like that and see it.
Well, the Romans who were doing it.
Yeah.
They just.
Well, and you think about the gladiators and the Colosseum and all those kind of, those were sporting events that they cheered on. I know. I can't imagine.
So there was a professor from Ozark named Mark Moore who took his students out, and he had a deer carcass, right? And he had a cat of nine tails that he'd gotten somehow, and he allowed the students to more or less go to town on this deer. And within the way he describes it, I obviously was not there, but the way that he describes it is that like after the first real lashing or whatever, like blood just kind of splurged everywhere, and it got on the girls that were standing around, and they're like, and so the guys just saw that as an invitation to get even more gruesome with it.
Yeah.
And so very quickly what he was astounded with was how fast it became a game to them. And these are, college students who were having fun with a deer. I mean, it was a dead animal, but just the very fact that we can dehumanize people so quickly. You treat Jesus like this dead deer, and it becomes a game for these Romans, right? And this was, remember, inside. So this was not exposed to the Jewish public.
Right.
right? So this
Did he
was.
do that on purpose? Do you think that if he'd done it in front of them, well, it would have made them all unclean, I guess. But do you think that they would have had a different reaction than that? That they would have said stop, stop, or do you think they would have just added in on them?
I mean, I don't know. I would think that they would add in on the, because they've already. I mean, they watched him get crucified, so they are there for that. Oh, let's move on.
It's like watching a train wreck, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, well, in my sociology class when I went to college, they were talking about something similar. It was about shocking other students. It was a college study.
Yeah.
And they were shocking these students and with electric shock. And to start with, they didn't want to do it, but the more power that they got, the more they weren't really shocking the other students, but they thought they were, and they kept cranking up the power to do harder and harder.
Yeah. I remember reading about that. Yep.
Yeah. And they just turned on each other really fast.
Mm-hmm.
It's just sin in the human flesh of our minds, and Bob sees that kind of crap all the time, or has. People do mean things.
Yeah. So Pilate presents this scourged Jesus, this beaten Jesus, this tortured Jesus as king with crown and robes. Pilate tries to get them to admit their submission to Caesar by needing him, that is Pilate, to do their dirty work. However, the charge finally comes down. He claims to be the Son of God. This is important for two reasons, right? So they finally, in verse 7, I think, they finally say he claims to be the Son of God, right? And so that's when the charge is finally kind of given. So the reader knows this to be true in light of Caesar's claim to be the Son of God. Is the first thing. Second is that Pilate fears this particular statement is the same thing as Caesar fearing this statement. So the fact that Pilate fears this event is stylistically, thematically the same thing as if Caesar himself feared this statement.
Which he wouldn't have.
In real life, no, but this is a thematic overlay, right? Pilate represents Caesar in this story. So thematically, because Pilate fears this statement, it's as if Caesar is also trembling in his boots. All right. So there's a little play on word here too, by the way. And I just made a joke. But anyways. Teuton ton logon is the phrase that this statement. All right. Let me go to the actual wording here. We have law, therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, okay, this statement, and the statement was that he himself claimed to be the Son of God, all right, feared this statement, logon, is the same word as, it's logos. So, in Greek, what's really cool is that he's effectively saying that Pilate feared this word, or the word that...
The word became flesh.
Yeah.
The word is and was God.
And so it brings the reader back to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So Pilate fears Jesus in this particular statement. Like, that's literally, in the Greek, it would be like him saying, and Jesus feared the Word, or the Word of God. I mean, we could add in the Word of God there. And that's what John is. It's a play on words. A pun.
So that
Clay would love it.
He is actually fearing, he is actually afraid emotionally Is that what you're saying? That when it says, and he was afraid, more afraid, that he wasn't actually emotionally more afraid? Is that what you're trying to say?
I don't know, because I don't really know what you're trying to say.
Well, verse 8. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid.
Uh-huh.
And you're saying...
So what I'm trying to say is that Pilate what John is doing here is he's playing on the scene that happened, okay, with a play on words. The fact that the Jews are the one who said he's the one who claimed to be the Son of God, but the way that John is presenting this information is that Pilate feared the Word of God.
So what it's like, I
So he
wouldn't say that
actually
his
feared
eyes were
Jesus.
open to who Jesus was, because I don't think he ever got that. But do you think he was afraid of what Jesus represented in terms of a threat to him? He was afraid of this guy's power, this guy's influence, but not necessarily afraid, because it didn't seem like he was ever accepting that who Jesus really said he was.
Yeah, I don't know that I can give you any sort of certain level of certainty answer. The text itself plainly says in English that he feared this because of this statement. He was even more afraid. So the idea of being more afraid means that he was afraid, right? And now his fear has escalated. What he's afraid of in the actual real life situation there, I would say is the loss of the political influence, right? So he fears losing control. He's a classic D personality, right? They have to be in control. So that's what I think Pilate is afraid of. But what I'm saying is that John is twisting, doing this play on words to make it sound like Pilate is afraid of Jesus. Which means
whether he knows it or not.
Whether he knows it or not, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because remember, the Gospel of John is a subversive retelling of the events to give this different take on what happened. And so the whole point of the Gospel of John is this subversion story that he's trying to get across, that while Pilate may have been the political victor of the day, it really was Jesus, because Pilate feared Jesus. So, I guess that's all I was trying to say.
You took a long way around to get to it.
Well, I had
It's
to...
complicated. It's very complicated
It is.
because we can't get into Pilate's mind to really know what he was thinking at that very moment.
And this is our only time, I believe, in all four Gospels when we're allowed to see into his psyche just that little bit.
Yeah, it is.
What were you going to say, Bob?
Oh, I think after he had Jesus scourged and he had the robe and the crown of thorns on, and he brought him back out. I mean, he probably, there's no doubt he looked horrible. I think that he's showing the Jews what he looked like, hoping that maybe this would bring them around to appeal to them. You know, you're sure you want to go through with this, because I still don't find anything to charge him with.
Mm-hmm.
I think he knows that he's not guilty of anything.
Oh yeah. I agree with that. Yeah.
And he gives them every opportunity not to carry through with what they're wanting to do. But I mean, they're dead set against it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just what I think he brings him out to show, you know, look what you're doing.
Well, I don't know that Pilate should have any concern for Jesus.
Except for that they want him crucified. And if he can get them to turn around and say, yeah, that's good enough.
Then it's a victory for him.
Yeah.
Then he won. Because he didn't crucify him, and they accepted that, this is
Right.
good enough.
Because he doesn't want to do their
That's what I'm
bidding,
thinking. He
right?
offers them Barabbas and they won't have it.
Who's the worst guy? I mean,
Barabbas was horrible.
he was horrible. I mean, he brought like up the worst criminal there was, trying to say, hey,
Yeah.
you got a good guy here who just got whipped and beaten, and the guy who really did horrible, you want him back in your community? You really want to trade this off?
Mm-hmm.
He probably walked away thinking these Jewish people are
That'd be like
something.
letting loose Charles Manson.
I think he just wanted the Jews to crumble and say, this is good enough.
I mean, he probably
We
thought
won't
these Jewish
crucify him.
people were nutty people. Like,
And
what
then he
are
would
they
have said,
thinking?
I won.
No.
You didn't crucify him.
I think I'm missing a slide.
Are you ready for
Don't have
layers?
level 1, 2, 3.
No layers?
There's C, but not B.
Yeah, because it
Okay,
goes
do
on
that.
to B.
Yeah, it skips layer 1, 2,
Yeah.
3.
All right. So I'll have to do this then from my handout. All right. So the particular scene that we have here of Pilate being presenting Jesus, the flogged Jesus, has 3 layers to it. So, right, the particular story has 3 layers of depth to it. As we progress through them, we get closer to John's intent to subvert the entire imperial understanding of power. Layer 1. And this is just like an initial kind of retelling of the events. It looks like Pilate is losing control of the mob, unable to secure freedom for Jesus. All right, so however you want to shorten that or abbreviate that. Pilate is losing control of the mob, unable to secure freedom.
Unable to secure
freedom. Layer 2 then is so that's just like an initial retelling of the events, which looks like what's happening in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right. Layer 2, Pilate is playing the Jews in service of his own political agenda. He parades out this mocked king of the Jews who's been beaten to a pulp, who's in a state of humiliation, and by that he calls him the king of the Jews to this lynch mob and says, look at your king, right? Look at what I have done to your king. So it's a whole power play, right? Yeah, look, this guy was nothing for me, and he is your king, right? So it's sort of this ironic statement that he's trying to make. That's layer 2. The third layer, so let me repeat that. Pilate is playing the Jews in service of his own political agenda. However you want to shorten that, it's up to you. Layer 3, so this is the deep level in what John is trying to actually retell the story and get across, is that Christ is completely in control, not the Jews or Pilate.
Amen.
So this story so far has had these 3 layers kind of been interwoven all throughout it, right? And so in this particular event, it's certainly coming to a head. And as we draw near to the end of the story, we obviously find out who wins what battle here. Okay. So B, the inside scene reveals, so we're in verses 9 through 11, which say, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin.
When he says, he who delivered you to me has a greater sin, he's talking about the Jews. Who's he talking about?
Well,
it's not Pilate, it's somebody else.
No, it's not Pilate. So there's really only 2 options, right? It's either the Jews who brought him, the crowd, or it's Judas, who was the one who started the whole thing. And the only reason why I would think that it's Judas over the Jews is because throughout the whole gospel, he says a lot of nasty things about Judas. And it's also, I believe, singular. He who has handed me over to you.
Yeah, instead of like those.
Instead of
these,
they or
these.
them. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that he defines sin as something that's on a continuum, but there is a greater sin, because normally we're taught that sin, whether you lie or murder, is still sin. But right here, he's saying this is greater.
There's a degree.
There's a degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is also very evident in the law code of Leviticus, right? There were acts that were so bad that it would defile the land, right? So that was seen as something that was worse than just a generic transgression, which one could cleanse themselves easily and go on. So, yeah.
And you got to remember, in the context, we're still in this. We're still under the Old Covenant, the Old Testament laws, not the New Covenant.
Not till Acts chapter 2. All right. So, So the scene, the inside scene reveals that Jesus is in fact in control of the situation. Perhaps Pilate is becoming aware of this fact. Jesus is insolent to Pilate's questions and straight up tells him he is not in charge. Right? So the fact that he says that he has the greater sin, right? This does not exonerate Pilate of what he's doing.
No.
All right. Pilate is still guilty in this. Jesus is not exonerating him of doing any wrong thing, but he is doing something very wrong. And Pilate is a pawn of Jesus. So in verse 11, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." This does not exonerate Pilate. Pilate is in fact a pawn of Jesus. So Pilate, or Jesus, straight up, the guy has been beaten to a pulp. He is being threatened with crucifixion, and the guy who runs all of Palestine says to him, "Don't you know I have the power to crucify you?" And this man who has been brought to his knees through scourging musters up the words to say, "You have no authority over me." Right? The irony there is rich, okay? Because Pilate has authority, demonstrated all of his authority over Jesus, but Jesus knows the truth, right? In that this has all been set up so that Jesus can be crucified, because that is the greater glory of the entire Gospel of John. And so Jesus is willingly marching towards this end, and he is making it so that Pilate has no option but to crucify him. So, and Pilate's claim, "I have the authority to kill you," really is Jesus has made it so he has no option but to kill him.
He's taunted him back.
So the irony of the story is very incredible, and certainly rich with meaning. All right, let's go to our final section. I'm getting my pages all mixed up here.
63, that A, when you said, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
To free Jesus.
Pilate attempts to free Jesus, yeah. But hang on a second.
I don't think this is new to Jesus, though, in terms of, he went through the temptations, up in the mountain of Satan, and here's another one. This is a great one, but this is one where he is marching toward the Lord, and here is this temptation of, if I were just to submit, maybe I wouldn't have to die on that cross. And Pilate is the pawn of temptation, maybe even being used by Satan to say, hey, if you can get him to not get to that cross, then Satan could have a victory. But Jesus was like, no, I'm
Yeah.
going to that cross. No matter what, I'm going to that cross. You can beat me to a pulp, but I'm going to that cross.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that Satan knew what the cross meant in that event. Like,
I bet he does now.
I bet he does now.
I think
Yeah, how much knowledge
Yeah.
he had over that, I don't know.
So I don't know.
I think he knew that Jesus was powerful because he
Oh, yeah.
tempted.
Yeah.
He did tempt
Yeah,
him,
he
so
knew
I
who
think
Jesus
he
was
knew.
for sure.
Yeah.
But he also, but I don't know that he understood. Satan understood what was the atonement, right? I don't think he understood what was happening on the cross, the penal substitution there, and because of this event, Satan loses all of his power, right? So yeah, I don't think Satan truly understands what's happening in this particular. I think he sees this as a good thing.
Do you think-
But I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
Satan, so I've never
And
talked
I
to the
think
guy.
He was very
So.
much a part of all this in the sense that the evil that's going on. I mean,
Yes, he's definitely
He's in this. I
Yeah.
mean, he's in this. He's riling up the troops. I mean, he thinks he's got the world on his side.
One last comment on that B prime section. The fact where Jesus says nothing, right? Jesus gave him no answer.
Where are you at?
That's verse 9, right? Page 61. I'm in the text.
Okay, 61.
Yeah, I'm in the text.
Okay.
And verse 9, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer.
Okay.
The fact that Jesus gave him no answer is in and of itself a slight against Pilate.
Oh.
Yeah, because he is, positionally, Pilate is his superior, right? And the fact that he is not answering Pilate is his way of subverting Pilate's authority. And then he responds in that same scene with, "You have no authority over me." So it's an addition, like a little extra snippet of subversion there. All right, last section. Pilate attempts to free Jesus as a result of his conversation with him. The Jews make this an impossibility. Therefore, Pilate returns to his attempt to get a political confession from them as subordinates. The final scene is full of great irony. All right, so you've had interactions here, all right, and ninja conversations, right, where Jesus is the victor. Pilate is now also having ninja warrior conversations with the Jews, right, and this political maneuvering, and Pilate turns out to be the victor. Okay, because in the end of the story, you've got. They say to him, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answers, "We have no king but Caesar." So then he handed him over to be crucified. He keeps pressing and pressing and pressing, and he keeps using the Jesus is king wordage to get the Jews to the point where they are at their wits' end and they submit. We have no king but Caesar. And because of that, Pilate doesn't give in to their demands. They have now responded the way that he wanted in the first place. Their submission to Caesar and to him. And so now he'll...
Let him go?
No, he kills him.
I know, but it says Pilate attempts to free Jesus as a result of his conversation with him.
Well, that's not...
Where did you get that?
As verse 12, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore Pilate heard these words. He brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat. So in verse...
Sounds
all right.
like the Jews are kind of winning over that, because he realizes that, so now I'm just going to release him. And he gives in to their cry of crucify.
Except the fact that he does not give in until they make the submissive statement, "We have no king but Caesar."
Yeah.
That's what he wanted from the very get-go.
Okay.
Was, I want you all to submit to my authority. right? And the way that he can get them to submit to his authority is by them claiming that Caesar is king, which is something that they would not do, right?
Otherwise.
Because, one, it's blasphemous for them to do that. And two, they've already shown signs of trying to subvert his reign with the whole shields and with the aqueduct thing and other instances that will come after this issue with Jesus. So Pilate is in a very political fight with the Jews, with the Jewish authorities, and he is here winning this because he gets them to confess Caesar is king.
It's almost like when a child wants something and you say please, say
Exactly.
please.
Yes.
You want me to kill him, so say please.
Exactly.
Tell me that I'm the greatest.
It's like he's dangling it in front of them. Now,
So then what's the thing about he attempts to set him free?
Yeah, okay. So I think he after his conversation with Jesus, I think at this point he tries to get Jesus to go free, because even if he gets Jesus to go free, he still wins.
Yeah, I'm not
Right? He still wins the political fight. When he realizes that is no longer possible, it even makes the comment, right, I got to saddle up for this. He sits down in the seat of judgment. All right? And from that point on, as soon as he sits down, Jesus is dying. All right? He's like, I've got it. I know Jesus has got to die in order for this situation to be resolved. I'm going to make them do what I want them to do before I give in. All right? So, and that is the confession that Caesar is king. And so even with that, is it a compromise? Perhaps a little, but it's still Pilate coming out on top.
Because he gets what he wants.
He gets what he wants. And then there's also the very fact that, they have blasphemed God on this holiday, which is all about, recognizing a God delivering them from an oppressor, a foreign oppressor, right? Pharaoh, right? So they were under the reign of Pharaoh, and they're celebrating the Passover, which is all about God freeing them from a foreign king who claims to be God, by the way. And here they are confessing that Caesar, who claims to be God, is king over them. So they're
still doing what they don't want. Even if he says, I'm trying to free him now, they're still crying crucify. So he's still, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Go on.
So Pilate declares Jesus is king in an attempt to mock the Jews, a statement with more truth than Pilate understands. I'm on the top of page 64. Remember what is truth, right? So he doesn't understand necessarily the truth that is playing out here. The Jews declare Caesar as their king, which is in fact blasphemy, yet they are accusing Jesus of blasphemy. They submit themselves to Pilate and to Rome by confessing Caesar as king, and they get their wish. Jesus dies to save the nation, but he is in fact saving the world. And Jesus has played both sides to bring about this situation and is now going to fulfill his glory, submitting to death, even death on a cross. So we've come to the end of the Pilate trial. Jesus is being sent off for crucifixion. And the discussion questions, it's after 8 o'clock. What do you make of this scene? What are your thoughts? This trial scene. I don't know why it says trip. So what do you make of this trial scene? What are your thoughts?
Well, what went through my head is when really bad things happen, people say, there's God, why can this happen? How does God let this happen? And so what went through my head when you asked that question was, God can use evil for his good, no matter what it is. And this is definitely evil, but...
Yeah, he uses a very violent act to bring redemption and reconciliation. Yeah.
That's what I thought. So for whatever it's worth, that's
a good...
should make us, well, I'll just answer for me. It makes me think about how worthless I really am and what sin does. When you look at what the cross is and what Jesus did, there ain't nobody ought to be able to look at themselves and think we're worth very much. But the other side of the coin is God loved us so much
You were worth
that
that.
He was willing to give His Son.
Right.
But it should make us examine ourselves very closely and see how horrible and terrible sin is and what the price that was paid that causes it to not be charged to us, but to a man that was innocent, had no sin whatsoever. It's my opinion. I think a lot of people know who Jesus is, but they don't know Jesus. They've never come to the realization of just how rotten they are, and they don't think about how rotten they really are and the price that was paid.
The overall magnitude of what it is and how insignificant we are.
It's when I hear a Christian say, my heart just, I'll never be able to forgive them. And I want to go, do you not know what sin we are guilty of ourselves, and Christ forgave, and God forgave. Don't ever say you can't, then you don't understand what forgiveness is all about, what you were given, the gift you were given.
Yeah.
It just makes me, when I look at myself and realize how I've trampled on God, how can I dare say I will never forgive someone else's transgression? I mean, it's like laughing at the cross and the whole thing of not getting it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder what it was like for Adam and Eve when they lived together as a couple and they hadn't opened their eyes yet, and then their eyes were open to evil. How many times they must have had a conversation of, I don't even know you anymore. Who are you? Don't you remember when you used to do this? Didn't you remember when you used to say this? Who are you now? Because you're so evil now. And then the other said the same thing to the other. But that's like the only, married, whatever, couple that had
that
opportunity to see each other in the purest, loving, sinless way.
Right.
And then see each other for the wickedness they really are too.
Yeah. Like,
yeah.
Can't believe we just ruined the whole world, right?
Can't believe we just ruined off the man of God.
I absolutely love you and I absolutely hate you. Like, all the way,
I never thought of that before.
God,
Wow.
I mean, having their eyes open to the wickedness that all of us are. I have never known myself not to have evil thoughts, but yet Adam and Eve remember a time when they didn't have those thoughts. They didn't have those desires. They didn't have that. And they probably wish they could have gone back.
And they lived with it for 900 years. For 900 years Eve went, I told you
They
so.
suffered it through their children killing each other.
How do you see social memory versus counter memory playing out in these trial scenes?
Oh gosh.
That's too deep for me. My mind's now.
We're all shot.
Yeah, I really am.
Social memory, the collective understanding of the events of our past.
Right.
9/11,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. The election of Donald Trump, those sorts of things.
The assassination of a president.
The assassination, So the impression that leaves on the psyche of the people. The counter memory is the smaller group of people who reinterpret those events differently. That maybe it's an oppressive event to them. They see those events differently because of a different situation in life. How do you see the social memory versus counter memory playing out in these trial scenes? The social memory being of the wide range of people that were there that day, and in the memory of the people, a crazy person who claimed to be the Son of God was killed. Rome asserted its authority over him and crucified him. Right?
But for the disciples, the counter memory is different because they know from this point on life is going to really change. Because they're a smaller group that just have different experiences with Jesus and they don't see him like the mob saw him. And now they don't have him.
And remember John's audience in all of this,
Yeah,
right?
that's
They are the smaller group, the 7 churches of
Ephesus.
Eastern or Western Turkey, right? And so they have Rome beating down on them with persecution. They've got the people from within who are the Gnostic teachers who are trying to destroy the story of Christ, and then they've also got the Jews in the synagogues who are kicking them out, and so they're being surrounded, and the Romans and the Jews and even the Gnostics all have a different story than what was told. And John is writing to tell those events but give a subversive story to it. No, this is not what that scene meant. This is what it meant. Jesus had the authority. He had the power. It was his will for him to go and die. And so John's gospel is riddled with all of these retelling of events that from the outside would look like Jesus lost, right? But from the inside, in the smaller group of John's disciples, we know, no, Jesus was actually in control. So let me go to my final thoughts, and then we'll get out of here. So when I've studied this passage, I'm always amazed at all the different factors at play. We have a mob demanding the death of a beloved rabbi. There is an immoral man known for his abuses and violence against the people. He reigned trying to assert his dominance over the people once again. And then there is the Son of God calculating every word and every action. It is the perfect storm that brought Christ to the cross precisely when he meant to. The Gospel of John is different from the other 3 in many ways that we have explored already, but perhaps one of its greatest characteristics is John's attempt to even reevaluate the role Christ had in his own crucifixion. He would have to overcome so much in order to get there. The obvious application for us today with this message is that we have world powers vying for dominance through violence and manipulation. The Jews and Pilate used violence and manipulation to try and get what they thought they wanted. All political leaders have either violence or manipulation. However, we know that Christ is the Prince of Peace and will one day give his kingdom over to his Father in heaven, the King. Christ's pacifism is his control of the situation. He has greater power that does not require violence to bring about his will, which does bring violence upon him rather than upon God's people. The irony of the Prince of Peace is at the heart of the gospel message. We will continue to be subjects of violence and manipulation as the world goes on fighting itself for power, but we are citizens of a kingdom that is none of this world, and as citizens of this kingdom should never resort to violence to assert its agenda.
Question. When was Paul around? Was he during this time or was he after?
Yeah, he was a young man during this.
So it could have
He was younger than
knew
Jesus.
about this, or he could have seen it even?
I think we would have been told. We would have been told if he was present at the crucifixion. I feel like Paul would have written about that in his letters. But we do know that he was close to the situation, because he is there for the stoning of Stephen, which is at most 6 months after the crucifixion of Jesus. So, and he's a young, feisty guy. So yeah, he was around. He may have even been in Jerusalem.
On Paul?
I already did that. It was called Romans.
Oh.
All right.
Been there, done that.
Well, I missed it.
I'll
For a year. We did that.
I'll do Romans.